It's late March here in Michigan, and believe it or not, we're starting seeds. That's right. It might look overcast. It may have snowed last night, but that's not stopping us because we got to get some stuff started for spring. Super excited about it. It's not going to be a lot, but it is going to be a start. So stay tuned because here's what we're starting in late March directly in the garden. Let's go. When it comes to planting early season crops, I consider early season being like late March to early April. You're still definitely getting nights below freezing. These nights are cold enough to where if you throw out something that is moderately cold hardy, it could still die. And so I'm throwing out the most cold hardy of the cold hardy. Just because you can plant a seed doesn't mean you should. For instance, kale, cabbage, cauliflower, crops like that. We've talked about how, it's snowing right now, believe it or not. Despite the fact that they are cold tolerant, we're not going to put those out in the garden right now. We're going to focus on 4 crops and 4 crops only. And the reason why we're starting so early is because we're practicing a method of gardening known as succession planting. This is a way for us to get seeds going now that can handle the cold weather, but if something happens or something goes wrong, or if we get everything right and according to plan, we're not going to have a harvest all at the same time because these crops that we're starting first, our very first plantings, they are often some of the fastest to mature, and they're often some of the fastest you can harvest. And what you don't want to do is you don't want to end up with, for instance, 9 pounds of lettuce, because who's going to eat 9 pounds of lettuce over the course of 3 or 4 days? It's a highly perishable product that is far better suited in the garden as a plant than it is in the kitchen as a produce item. So we're going to get through, we're going to start planting, we're going to go through the plants, and I'm also going to talk about how I succession sow, because it's really important that you succession sow correctly so you have success. So the first crop we were directly sowing in the ground in late March, early April is lettuce. Now this is probably one of my favorite crops to sow in late winter, early spring, because lettuce is very cold tolerant, especially if you pick the right varieties. Now you'll notice I didn't sow all my lettuce varieties. I sowed the most cold hardy lettuce varieties. I have here the Tango leaf lettuce, I have the black-seeded Simpson, I have the Lola Rosa leaf lettuce, and I have Cimarron or any type of red lettuce. Your red and purple lettuces are going to be the most cold tolerant, but I also find that these roughly leaves, they tend to be also the most cold tolerant of the green leafed varieties. I will plant other lettuces later in succession sowing, but for right now we're sowing these because they can handle the colder weather. Now we are going to be practicing a method called high intensity spacing. Now, high intensity spacing is basically spacing that is so close together that we are not growing them for a head. We're not growing these out for their heads of lettuce. We're growing them out for their leaves. And when we sow them, we're putting them in rows that are spaced. For me, this is about 2 inches wide. And so I've done two shovel widths apart, which is about 4 inches. So my rows are 4 inches apart. And I'm going to take my seed, and it's black seed, so it's going to be a little difficult to see, but you get the idea. I'm going to take my seed, and I'm going to put a seed about every ½ inch. And that way, when they germinate, there's going to be a very dense planting of lettuce that grows up as a thick mat. And as that thick mat of lettuce grows up, it's going to self-thin. A lot of gardeners make the mistake of thinning their lettuce, but lettuce is a crop that if it's sowed too close, yes, some thinning may be necessary. But if it's spaced a ½ inch, maybe 3/4 of an inch apart, it will self-regulate. The weakest will just die off, the healthiest will prevail, and they will naturally just continue to space themselves out without much assistance from you as the gardener. We're going to plant some Cimarron here, same thing. I'm just tapping and moving my hand. And I'm getting about a seed, sometimes 2 or 3 seeds even. I'm not coming back. I'm not moving those seeds. I'm just going to let them germinate. And what will happen is as they grow up, because the rows are so close together, they will grow up and they will hit each other and go up rather than out. Because their natural tendency is to want to move out, but they're going to hit each other's leaves, grow up. And that's going to end up shading the soil as well, which we talk about is so important because that will not only protect the soil from weeds, it will also protect the soil from evaporation. It will also help to shade the soil to keep it cooler in the event that you happen to get some warm spring days. It'll help to keep the soil cooler so you can grow the lettuce longer without it going to seed. The second crop that I absolutely love to plant in late March and early April, and this is probably one of my favorites, is radishes. I absolutely love radishes just because I can't think of a crop that you can sow directly into the garden and then be harvesting that crop within 25 to 35 days. It's just remarkable how fast radishes can be ready to be harvested. And I love radishes for that. It's instant gratification for a gardener, especially if you have spring fever like I do and you just want to get out, get your hands in the dirt. It's really remarkable you can have a harvest so fast. But you'll notice I'm not sowing all the radish seeds that I'm going to be growing, because radish seeds, because they're ready so fast in 25 to 35 days, I do not have the ability to eat 5-6 pounds of radishes over the course of a week, because when they're ready, they're ready. They need to be pulled out of the ground and consumed. Otherwise, they will either get woody or start to go to seed, in which the harvest is lost at that point. And so a lot of you ask the next question, which is, okay, so you're not sowing all your seed at once, you are succession sowing. Succession sowing, again, is just a way of spreading out the amount of seeds you intend on starting over a duration of time. So for instance, this bed here is going to be all radishes. But you'll notice I'm going to stop at about a 30% mark, leaving about 60% of the bed unplanted. And that is intentional because I'm going to be planting out the rest of the 60% over the course of about 6 to 7 weeks. Now, that brings about the next question. Well, how do I know how much I should be sowing and when should I sow my seed? That really does come down to personal preference. The biggest thing you want to ask yourself is, how much do you plan on consuming? Because that's the first thing. Because ideally, the reason why we are succession sowing is because we know how much we can consume each given harvest. And so from this bed here, from this maybe 3 to 5 square feet, I'm going to get roughly a pound to pound and a half of radishes. That pound to pound and a half of radishes will last us 5 to 7 days, especially if we keep it in the crisper in the fridge. Should last us 5 to 7 days, no problem. And because of that, we're going to have a week's worth of groceries that we can consume and not have to go back out into the garden and harvest more. It also means that the harvest can stay, fresh in the fridge and not expire in the garden. That's a huge mistake that gardeners will simply say, well, I'm going to take in what I need, I'll leave into the garden what I don't need. There are some crops, for instance, a tomato. When the tomato is ripe and red, you leave it on the vine too long, it's going to expire. It doesn't just stay there forever, right? It's not permanent. Some crops can be. Some crops like potatoes, you can leave them in the ground. Heck, you could leave them in the ground over winter, covering up with leaves, and they're fine. But radishes are not that case. Radishes, when they're ready to go. And you have about a 2-week window to enjoy them before they start to go to seed. And so ask yourself how much you're going to consume in that 2-week window, and then use that as your guide. From that point, you want to ask yourself how fast they take to germinate and how fast they take to mature, being right around 3 to 5 days to germinate, and then roughly about 25 to 35 days to mature, meaning you have about, let's say, 35 to 40 total days. Okay, well, if I put seeds in the ground here and I plant 30% of my bed, I know that in 35 to 45 days, I'm going to be getting a harvest of radishes. But then I need to have another round of radishes ready to go within that 1 to 2 week period. So how long do I wait? About 1 to 2 weeks. And that way I can properly plan how much I need to plant and when I need to plant. Every crop's going to be different. Lettuce is going to be slightly different than radishes. My lettuce, for instance, I can harvest from that for about 4 to 5 weeks before it becomes too many cuts and it becomes kind of old and tired and needs to be refreshed. I'm going to essentially look at my lettuce like a little bit longer than I would my radishes. My radishes, a week or two. I'm going to have my plantings spaced out about 2 weeks apart between my plantings so that I have essentially 6 weeks where I can enjoy radishes. Lettuce, I'm going to plant my spacing about every 4 to 5 weeks apart. I might only plant out 25% of my total bed. In fact, I'll show you real quick. Check it out. I've broken my lettuce bed up into quarters, so I've only planted out 25% of my lettuce bed. That's just what works well for me. You can succession sow as often as you want. That's the really amazing thing about succession sowing, is I could have broken this bed up and divided it into 6 separate parts, and I could have planted 1/6 of my total lettuce consumption, and then waited about 3 to 4 weeks and planted out my second 6th, section. I could have broken it up into 8ths. You can break it up as many times as you want, and that essentially breaks down. If you don't consume that much lettuce, don't plant out that much. We have our family, we have our extended family, we have neighbors, we have staff. So I find breaking up my lettuce bed into quarters is plenty fine for me. But if you don't consume that much lettuce, heck, break it up into 10ths even. I don't care. You can break it up as many times as you want, but you have to remember that each block needs to be kept the correct distance apart from each other in terms of the duration that you're sowing. Every block has to be reserved. That does take some reserve on your part to not scratch that itch. But you just have to remember that you have a plan, and that plan is to have perpetual harvests throughout the season. Now, if this seems confusing to you, it shouldn't be, because there's also some amazing software at your disposal, and that brings us to the sponsor of today's episode, SeedTime. SeedTime is an amazing garden planning software that can actually help you to plan your garden. Not only look at your overall garden plan and plan where you're planting what and where, but it also can help you with the topic of succession sowing. One of my favorite components. I've actually used SeedTime myself. That's why when they reached out to me, I said, heck yeah, I would love you to sponsor an episode, because we personally have used SeedTime. We absolutely love the software. And what it allows you to do is it allows you to grid out your garden and say, I'm planting lettuce here, tomatoes there, whatever. But it also allows you to choose when you're sowing something based on a calendar. One of my favorite components of SeedTime software is based on what I'm planting. It will tell you if you're going to succession sow, when you should be succession sowing those crops. And I absolutely love their software. It's absolutely amazing. And I want to thank SeedTime for sponsoring today's episode, because they are probably one of my favorite ways to, in their own words, get a perpetual harvest. I'm someone that I want to grow as much food as possible in my garden, and I want to grow it for as long into the season as possible. And I find that sometimes, because there's so many different crops, sometimes it's nice to have a refresher or a reminder on you should be planting this, not just in the spring, but also in the fall. And there is so much more at your disposal with SeedTime software. And so I hope you'll check it out. Again, I want to have a huge thank you for SeedTime for sponsoring today's episode. I will have links to their website and any other links to their socials and software in the description box down below. Check it out. You will absolutely love it. I guarantee you. Like I said, I've used it, and I've used it for years, and I absolutely love it. So I think it'd be an awesome tool for you to not only help plan your garden, but help plan on when you're planting as well. The next crop that we're planting in early spring, late March, early April, and you want to get it in the ground at the right time, not too early, not too late, are peas. I absolutely love peas. Spring peas are some of my favorite peas to grow. They are crisp, they are sweet. The variety I'm growing today, it's called Sugar Snap. There's probably 3 or 4 different varieties of pea that I absolutely love. I've grown the Golden Sweet, and they're amazing as well. I'm not picky when it comes to peas. I just absolutely love them. They never make it past probably 3 feet past the garden. They're already gone. We are going to only sow 1 trellis. You can succession sow them as well. The thing with peas is that if you sow them too early, they are frost sensitive, but you sow them too late and they take between 45 and 55 days to mature. And if you get too warm of weather, it can actually inhibit their harvest, inhibit their growth, and ultimately, because the stem is so thin, you'll find that they can wither rather easily. So because of that, I like to sow mine early. I tend to sow mine late March, early April. I look at the 10-day forecast. If there's nothing in the low 20s, mid 20s, I go ahead and start my seeds, because it's going to take them also probably 3 to 7 days to actually germinate, especially if it's colder out. So they do take a little longer when the soil is colder for them to germinate. But once they germinate, they should be growing in early April. By that time, it should be early April by the time they're up and growing. And at that point, we should be well out of the threat of any killing temperatures for peas. But you absolutely can succession sow these as well. Now, the final thing I was going to mention with succession sowing, which makes it really important on how many successions you can do, has to do with the length of season. You see, you can succession sow literally anything in the garden. We've succession sowed even tomatoes, believe it or not. And when it comes to succession sowing tomatoes, okay, we have the entire season. But we know that the season for tomatoes starts to kind of end under normal circumstances. If we plant out our garden with our tomatoes in early May, come early to mid-August, those tomatoes are tired, they're fatigued, especially late August. But we still have growing season left in September and October, believe it or not. So 2 full months of growing season. So what do? I succession sow a second planting of tomatoes that can go into the garden approximately a month to a month and a half after my first planting of tomatoes. That means when my first planting goes in the ground in May, I'm planting my second succession of tomatoes in early July. Late June, early July, those tomatoes, the seedlings, are going in the ground so that they are up and growing and maturing at a time when my main planting is fizzling out. That's going to be different from something like lettuce, because the season for lettuce, they don't like that hot weather as much. And so you could, let's say you succession sowed every 2 weeks. Every 2 weeks, you're starting lettuce every 2 weeks. At a certain point, you have to have a stopping point. And that stopping point should be at the point in which lettuce won't grow. Seed time software will also kind of help with that as well, because the thing is certain seasons are cut short based on temperatures or environmental conditions. Radishes, their season is even shorter. I find that as soon as the weather gets above 70, 75 degrees for longer than a week, the season for radishes is done. Similarly, my fourth and final crop that we're going to be sowing and can succession sow is spinach. I absolutely love sowing spinach in the early spring as well. But the thing is that with spinach, the season is about as short as it is with radishes. If you have weather that gets into the mid to upper 70s for longer than a week, they start to go to seed. So at that point, your season is done. So yes, I might sow out about 30% of this bed with spinach now. I'll wait about 2 weeks. I'll put another 30% of my spinach seed in. I'll wait about 2 more weeks and plant 30% more. But if I were to break that up and plant, let's say, break it up into quarters and plant a quarter, 2 weeks quarter, 2 weeks quarter, 2 weeks and a quarter, I may run out of time. And that final planting may not have enough time to fully mature before the warm weather comes and essentially kills it off. So just keep that in mind as well. That, like when I said with lettuce that you could break the bed up into 1/8 or even 1/10, you totally can if your season allows for it. The only way that you can get around that is by shortening your duration. Rather than waiting the full duration, start every week, right? You could break that bed up into 1/8. I could break this bed up into 1/8 if I wanted to as well. But I would have to shorten the duration of which I was succession sowing so that I was getting more plantings in that window of time before my season is over for that crop. Just another very important note to make about succession sowing. And with spinach, same exact thing applies to lettuce. I like to sow them rather densely because they're a leafy green crop. And yes, they do need a little bit more spacing than lettuce does because the leaves don't like to go upwards. They kind of like to fold out a little bit. I will space my spinach seed out. I'll do 1 seed about every 1/2 inch. And that way I can, if I have to come back in thin, I do. But oftentimes I don't have to do much thinning with 1 seed about every 1/2 inch. And again, I'm only planting out about 30% of the overall space. And then I'm gonna come back in about 2 weeks and plant the other 30%, the next 30% with spinach as well. The variety I'm growing today is an American spinach. I absolutely love this variety for early spring. Another great early spring variety is Viroflay or Butterfly. 3 great varieties of early spring spinach that you are definitely going to want to add into your garden. So that is about it for early spring planting. I know that you are probably itching to get other stuff started, like carrots and beets and kale and cabbage and kohlrabi and all your other brassicas, but there is a time for those as well. And I promise you that time will be quickly approaching, but it does not make a whole lot of sense to rush them. Again, even if they're in the ground, they're gonna stay in the ground. And you only risk the seeds molding or rotting or getting consumed by an early season pest like a mouse or a vole, because they need a little bit warmer soil temperatures. This is very early season, and I'm aware of that. We're not starting out our entire garden by any means. So we're just getting the very first kind of beginnings of our garden planted. So I hope you will follow me on this. I know that a lot of gardeners have already gotten lots of crops started, but they're further south and the weather is more warm, and that's okay too. But here in Michigan, this is what we're starting in late March to early April. It's been kind of an abnormally cold spring. We had a warm up and then it cooled off, and it's been quite cold. In fact, today it's frigidly cold. But just remember, spring is right around the corner. We're gonna start slow, and as we get into April, we're gonna be planting even more stuff, and most of our garden will be fully planted by early to mid-April. So stay tuned, keep watching. If you haven't yet subscribed, make sure to do that. We've got lots more planting videos, lots more tutorials, and if you have any questions on anything you've seen in this video, feel free to post comments in the comments box down below. I will be monitoring those comments and answering questions when I have time. So thank you so much for your support. And as always, this is Luke from the MIgardener channel. And thank you, Seed Time, by the way, for sponsoring today's episode. This is Luke from the MIgardener channel, reminding you to grow bigger. Take care. Bye. Hey, thank you so much for watching today's video. I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed, consider clicking this one. You'll probably enjoy it just as much. I want to thank you for your viewership, because without it, this channel would not be as amazing as it is. Also, if you haven't subscribed, consider subscribing. It's free, and we upload videos every Monday, Wednesday, or Friday. We also have vegetable seeds, fertilizer, or tools. If you need any of those, consider visiting MIgardener.com. Links will be in the description box below. We've got you covered. And as always, we'll see you all in the garden. Take care. Bye.